what I think is where they think that you went too far.
I don't care.
I
don't care. Oh. There is no too far. I don't play like that. So that's why you don't play with me.
Right.
That's why you don't play with me.
Right.
There is no too far.
Right.
It's not.
Right.
Forever.
Is there any
Leave
time?
it alone. Leave me be. Leave me be, because there's no too far. Right. That's how it goes. But that's the thing. No. They won't play by. That's the thing.
Is there any time
that's the problem.
You felt like you went too far?
Who, me?
Yeah.
I'd never go too far. There is no too far. There's no too far. Absolutely. Promise you.
Before the rivalry had a name, before it could be reduced to tracks, headlines, and timelines, there was a landscape already under pressure. Hip-hop in the early 21st century was no longer simply a genre. It was an empire, an economy, a system of symbols where visibility functioned as power and absence felt like erasure. Success no longer meant survival alone. It meant centrality. To exist at the center was to control narrative gravity, to shape taste, to decide what sounded like now. In that environment, voices did not merely compete. They orbited. They collided. They cast shadows that grew larger than the bodies producing them. The stage had expanded beyond cities and scenes into a permanent global arena, lit by constant media glare. Nothing remained private for long. Every move echoed. Every silence spoke. Drake emerged within this world not as a disruptor, but as a perfect instrument of its expansion. His ascent coincided with a moment when rap was learning to speak fluently in the language of pop without fully surrendering its edge. He occupied the center with ease. Melodic, confessional, polished. His presence felt ambient, ubiquitous. He did not demand attention so much as absorb it. Charts bent around him. Platforms amplified him. His voice became familiar to audiences far beyond hip-hop's traditional borders, seeping into spaces once closed to rap entirely. Pusha T existed in a different register. His voice carried the density of a closed system. Minimal, severe, precise. He did not expand outward. He dug inward. His world was narrow by design, built on repetition, discipline, and control. Where others chased breadth, he refined depth. Where others blurred lines, he sharpened them. His music did not ask for universal acceptance. It demanded recognition on its own terms. For years, these two forces coexisted without direct collision. They occupied the same genre, but not the same space. One stood under the brightest lights, moving freely across platforms and audiences. The other remained anchored to a colder terrain, where credibility was not negotiated through numbers, but through consistency. Their paths crossed indirectly, through affiliations, loyalties, and inherited tensions, but the friction had not yet ignited. What connected them was not similarity, but proximity. They were close enough to threaten each other symbolically, without needing to share the same aesthetic language. That closeness created instability. In systems of power, rivalry does not require opposition in style. It requires overlap in claim. Both artists, in different ways, laid claim to authority within hip-hop's hierarchy. Not the same authority, but authority nonetheless. Drake's claim rested on reach, on omnipresence, on the ability to define the sound of an era through sheer scale. Pusha T's claim rested on legitimacy, on authorship, on lineage, on the idea that rap was not only entertainment, but testimony. One embodied the future-facing flexibility of the genre. The other embodied its memory, its codes, its unspoken rules. This tension was not immediately visible because it did not begin as personal animosity. It began as structural incompatibility. A genre that once thrived on scarcity now thrived on saturation. The rules that governed respect had shifted. Success had become both proof and suspicion. The larger the platform, the more fragile authenticity appeared. The smaller the space, the more intensely it was guarded. In that climate, admiration could curdle into resentment without either party intending it. Influence could be mistaken for appropriation. Silence could be interpreted as strategy. Hip-hop had always contained these dynamics, but the scale had changed. The arena was larger, the audience louder, the stakes higher. When conflict finally surfaced, it would not feel sudden. It would feel inevitable. The early signals were subtle. A line here, an omission there. Alliances that carried historical weight. Names invoked indirectly. Nothing explosive. Nothing explicit. But enough to suggest that something was misaligned. That the balance of power was not settled. That two different visions of what rap should represent were quietly measuring each other. Drake moved with the confidence of someone who belonged everywhere at once. Pusha T moved with the precision of someone who chose exactly where to stand. One expanded territory by absorbing influences. The other defended territory by defining its borders. These were not just artistic choices. They were philosophical positions within a culture that had always wrestled with questions of ownership, voice, and legitimacy. The media environment magnified these positions. Every gesture was archived, every quote circulated, every collaboration interpreted. The audience became participants, sorting allegiance through playlists and comment sections. What once unfolded in studios and streets now unfolded in feeds and timelines. Rivalry no longer needed physical proximity. It only needed symbolic overlap. By the time the tension became audible, it had already been accumulating for years. Not as a feud, but as a fault line. A pressure point where two models of success pressed against each other. One optimized for expansion. The other optimized for endurance. One treated visibility as currency. The other treated it as a liability unless earned through substance. This is where the story begins, not with an insult or a revelation, but with a system stretched thin, with a genre negotiating its identity in the age of permanent exposure, with two figures positioned differently within the same empire, each reflecting something the other could not fully embody. The rivalry between Pusha T and Drake did not erupt because one wanted to destroy the other. It emerged because both represented incompatible answers to the same question. What does power in hip-hop actually mean now? The opening tension was invisible, but it was already shaping the ground beneath them. Drake's formation cannot be separated from the architecture that carried him upward. His early positioning inside the industry placed him within an already functioning empire, one built on visibility, distribution, and narrative control. His rise unfolded less like an insurgency and more like an annexation. He entered hip-hop through structures that had already mastered scale, inheriting not just opportunity, but a model of success where adaptability mattered as much as authorship. In that system, identity was something to be curated publicly, not defended privately. Psychologically, this produced a figure fluent in mirroring. Drake's artistic sensibility thrived on absorption. He reflected regional sounds, emotional registers, and stylistic codes back to the culture at large, often faster and more accessibly than their points of origin. This was not imitation in the narrow sense, but mediation. He functioned as a relay point, translating subcultural signals into mass appeal. That translation granted him power, but it also positioned him as perpetually in between genres, between audiences, between authenticity and performance. That in-between state carried an inherent vulnerability. To occupy the center is to be seen from all angles. To belong everywhere is to be fully owned nowhere. Drake's persona therefore leaned heavily on affirmation. Numbers mattered. Reception mattered. The crowd's response became a form of grounding. Success was not just external reward, it was internal stabilization. Without it, the structure felt exposed. Pusha T emerged from a radically different psychological terrain. His foundation was built on limitation rather than expansion. The world he represented was narrow, controlled, and repetitive by choice. His subject matter did not evolve toward universality. It condensed toward specificity. This was not a lack of imagination. It was a deliberate refusal to dilute meaning. His authority rested on the belief that repetition, when disciplined, becomes proof. Where Drake's identity was shaped by visibility, Pusha T's was shaped by withholding. He did not explain himself. He did not soften his edges to invite new audiences. His voice assumed prior knowledge. It assumed initiation. That posture created distance, but it also created density. Listeners were not courted. They were tested. Psychologically, this orientation fostered a strong internal center. Pusha T did not need consensus to validate his position. His relationship to power was not aspirational. It was custodial. He saw himself as a keeper of codes rather than a pioneer of new forms. That distinction matters. One expands territory. The other protects borders. One seeks recognition through adaptation, the other through resistance. These differing orientations shaped how each artist related to lineage. Drake's lineage was hybrid, assembled from influence rather than inheritance. He referenced predecessors with admiration, but his authority did not depend on continuity. It depended on relevance. His success validated itself by scale. Pusha T's lineage was vertical. He positioned himself within a chain of transmission. His credibility came from consistency with that chain, not deviation from it. This divergence created a latent asymmetry. Drake could move freely across spaces without needing permission. Pusha T could not. But Pusha T did not want to. His power came from immobility, from standing in one place long enough to claim it as ground. In cultural systems, mobility often looks like dominance, but immobility can look like defiance. Each interprets the other as lacking something essential. The industry amplified this misalignment. Drake's environment rewarded speed, reach, and responsiveness. Pusha T's rewarded patience, precision, and memory. One operated in an ecosystem driven by immediacy, the other in one driven by accumulation. When these systems intersect, misunderstanding becomes inevitable. What one perceives as flexibility, the other perceives as dilution. What one perceives as integrity, the other perceives as limitation. Importantly, this tension did not initially require direct contact. It existed as a background hum. Affiliations mattered. Alliances carried symbolic weight. Drake's loyalty to a particular power structure placed him, whether intentionally or not, on one side of an older conflict. Pusha T's history positioned him on the other. Their rivalry was therefore not born in isolation. It was inherited, an extension of unresolved tensions already embedded in the culture. Psychologically, this inheritance sharpened perception. Actions were read symbolically rather than literally. Lines were interpreted as signals. Silence was read as strategy. In such environments, intent becomes less important than position. Each move is weighed not only for what it says, but for where it places the speaker within the broader map of power. By the time their paths began to cross audibly, the conditions for conflict were already complete. Two different models of legitimacy occupied the same genre, one rooted in expansion and mediation, the other rooted in restriction and authorship. Both claimed authority. Both believed the other's claim threatened something fundamental. This is the field in which the rivalry took shape, not as a clash of personalities, but as a collision between two incompatible ways of inhabiting hip-hop. The friction was structural. The escalation would be symbolic. The rivalry does not announce itself with a declaration. It begins indirectly, through alignment and inheritance rather than confrontation. Drake enters the conflict space not by naming Pusha T, but by positioning himself unmistakably within a structure that Pusha T already stands in opposition to. Loyalty becomes the first visible vector of friction. Drake's allegiance to an established power block is not framed as aggression. It is framed as gratitude. But gratitude, when displayed publicly, can function as a claim. It draws borders. It declares sides. Early gestures are subtle. Lines that gesture backward rather than forward. References that assume shared context. Drake's language during this phase is careful, but not neutral. He frames himself as the rightful beneficiary of a lineage that has already been contested. By doing so, he inherits not just protection, but unresolved animosity. The rivalry thus begins as a proxy conflict. Drake speaks from within a house that Pusha T has already marked as compromised. For Pusha T, this is not merely opportunism from a younger artist. It is symbolic intrusion. Drake's early admiration for the lineage Pusha T represents only sharpens the tension. Admiration that later converts into dismissal carries a particular sting. It suggests replacement. The student no longer needs the teacher. The admirer now speaks from a higher platform. In symbolic economies, that reversal is never innocent. The first direct responses operate through mirroring. Drake speaks in partial gestures, embedding dismissals within broader narratives of assent. His tone is not combative. It is declarative. He positions himself as someone who has outgrown certain influences. The implication is clear. What once mattered no longer does. This framing does not attack Pusha T's skill. It attacks his relevance. It relocates him to the past. Pusha T's reply arrives differently. It does not dilute its intent inside broader success narratives. It isolates the target. His response is surgical. Where Drake uses implication, Pusha T uses accusation. The language sharpens. The focus narrows. This asymmetry is critical. One artist treats conflict as background noise to growth. The other treats it as a test of legitimacy. Psychologically, this marks the first clear divergence in strategy. Drake's approach assumes that dominance is self-evident. He believes scale itself neutralizes challenge. Pusha T operates from the opposite assumption. He believes that scale invites scrutiny. The larger the platform, the more pressure it can withstand before collapsing. He does not aim to match Drake's reach. He aims to destabilize the narrative that supports it. At this stage, the conflict remains deniable. No explicit names, no definitive lines, but the audience begins to triangulate. Patterns emerge. Affiliations clarify intent. The rivalry becomes legible not through confession, but through repetition. Each exchange adds weight. Each response tightens interpretation. Media plays a crucial role here. The environment rewards speculation. Ambiguity fuels engagement. Every lyric becomes a site of analysis. The absence of direct confrontation allows both artists to maintain plausible deniability while still escalating tension. This is not accidental. It reflects an understanding of how modern conflict circulates. Silence and suggestion can generate more attention than overt aggression. For Drake, this phase reinforces his belief that he can absorb tension without consequence. His momentum continues uninterrupted. The charts respond. The audience expands. Conflict appears manageable, even useful. It adds edge without threatening stability. From his position at the center, opposition looks distant. For Pusha T, the lack of immediate consequence is not discouraging. It confirms his diagnosis. The system protects its center until it cannot. He is not testing Drake's popularity. He is testing the resilience of the persona that popularity sustains. His responses grow more pointed, more personal, but remain controlled. He is not rushing. He is mapping. Symbolically, the conflict shifts from inherited tension to personal incompatibility. Drake's identity as a mediator becomes a liability. His position between worlds invites questions of authorship and ownership. Pusha T's identity as a custodian becomes a weapon. His refusal to expand allows him to focus pressure on specific fault lines. This first movement does not resolve anything. It clarifies positions. The arena is defined. The boundaries are visible. The audience understands that something has begun, even if it cannot yet name its endpoint. The rivalry has moved from background hum to audible frequency. The escalation is still restrained, but the logic of conflict is now active, and once activated, it seeks completion. The second movement begins when ambiguity stops serving both sides equally. What was once a field of implication hardens into a contest of exposure. Drake's confidence in scale now faces a different kind of pressure. The more visible he becomes, the more his narrative coherence matters. Success no longer shields him automatically. It invites interrogation. Pusha T understands this shift intuitively. He does not escalate volume. He escalates specificity. Drake's responses during this phase grow sharper, but also more defensive. He begins to speak less as a distant observer and more as a participant who must assert control. His language turns toward dismissal through minimization. He frames his opponent as limited in scope, confined to a narrow aesthetic, incapable of expansion. The subtext is clear. Cultural power belongs to those who can move. Those who cannot move are static. Those who are static eventually fade. This logic reflects Drake's own relationship to dominance. Power for him is cumulative. It stacks through presence. Each release reinforces the last. Each collaboration extends reach. From this vantage point, conflict is manageable as long as it remains abstract. A rival without scale cannot threaten an empire, but this assumption relies on one fragile premise: that attention only flows upward. Pusha T disrupts that premise by reframing the conflict around authorship and legitimacy. His attacks no longer concern status. They concern construction. He questions not how large Drake is, but how he is built. The focus shifts from outcome to process, from popularity to provenance. This is a crucial turn. It relocates the battle from charts to credibility. Psychologically, this is where projection intensifies. Drake reads these challenges as envy. Pusha T reads Drake's defenses as insecurity. Each interpretation reinforces the other. Drake responds by emphasizing independence and self-creation. Pusha T responds by emphasizing mediation and reliance. The clash is no longer about music alone. It is about whether power should be earned through expansion or through authorship. As the exchanges continue, the media ecosystem amplifies the stakes. Commentary fragments the conflict into talking points. Fans choose sides less on lyrical merit and more on identification. Drake's supporters frame the rivalry as an example of an established figure being targeted unfairly by purists unwilling to accept change. Pusha T's supporters frame it as a necessary correction, a reminder that scale does not equal substance. The rivalry now operates as a proxy debate about hip-hop itself. What does the genre owe its past? What does it owe its future? Can both coexist without contradiction? Drake embodies synthesis. Pusha T embodies preservation. The audience is asked implicitly to decide which vision feels more legitimate. Drake attempts to regain narrative control by widening the frame. He shifts focus toward broader conflicts and alliances, absorbing the rivalry into a larger web of antagonisms. By doing so, he dilutes its intensity. Pusha T responds by narrowing further. He isolates Drake as a singular case study. This asymmetry becomes pronounced. One expands to reduce pressure. The other concentrates to increase it. The lyrical exchanges reflect this difference. Drake's language grows layered, filled with references that spread attention across multiple targets. Pusha T's language grows austere. He returns to the same accusations, refining them rather than abandoning them. Repetition becomes a form of insistence. Each iteration sharpens the blade. Symbolically, the arena tightens. What began as inherited friction now feels personal. Not emotional, but existential. Drake's public persona relies on adaptability and emotional openness. Pusha T's critiques threaten to reframe those qualities as instability and dependence. This is dangerous terrain. If the persona cracks, the empire trembles. At this stage, Drake still believes he controls the tempo. He responds quickly. He stays visible. He projects confidence. But speed does not equal direction. Pusha T's slower cadence creates anticipation. Silence becomes strategic. The absence of response builds pressure rather than dissipating it. The audience senses that something is being prepared. The conflict now resembles a siege rather than a skirmish. Drake occupies the center, fortified by success and attention. Pusha T circles the perimeter, testing walls rather than storming gates. Each test reveals a weakness, not in numbers but in narrative cohesion. The more Drake speaks, the more material accumulates for reinterpretation. This is the moment when the rivalry's logic becomes irreversible. Drake cannot disengage without appearing evasive. Pusha T cannot disengage without abandoning the position he has methodically constructed. Both are locked into roles shaped by their identities. Expansion versus concentration. Mediation versus authorship. Reach versus pressure. The audience senses the shift. The tone changes. Commentary grows less playful. Stakes feel higher. This is no longer a battle of wit. It is a battle over symbolic authority. Who gets to define what counts as real? Who gets to decide which forms of success are legitimate? By the end of this movement, the field is primed for rupture. The next escalation will not be incremental. It will be structural. The question is no longer who is winning. It is how far one is willing to go to force recognition. The final escalation does not arrive as a surprise. It arrives as a consequence. By this point, the rivalry has exhausted ambiguity. Every gesture is read as intentional. Every silence is read as calculation. The field has narrowed to a single axis of confrontation. Drake stands at the center, fully illuminated, surrounded by echoes of his own success. Pusha T stands just outside that light, close enough to be seen, far enough to remain unabsorbed. Drake's move in this phase reflects urgency. His response sharpens in tone and intent. He abandons distance and addresses the challenge directly, questioning the foundation of Pusha T's authority. He reframes the conflict as a matter of authenticity versus performance, attempting to reverse the pressure. If legitimacy is the battleground, then he will contest ownership of that ground. He challenges the past itself, suggesting that the narrative Pusha T relies on is exaggerated, outdated, or borrowed. This is a risky maneuver. In symbolic conflicts, attacking an opponent's origin story is not merely an insult. It is a declaration of war. Drake's strategy assumes that destabilizing Pusha T's mythology will neutralize his leverage. But mythology, once established, does not collapse easily. It resists direct assault, and more importantly, it invites retaliation in kind. Pusha T's response arrives with precision and restraint. He does not escalate in volume or frequency. He escalates in intimacy. The scope of the conflict contracts suddenly. What had been a public debate about credibility becomes a targeted examination of persona. Pusha T shifts from critiquing Drake's artistic construction to interrogating the narrative scaffolding that supports his public identity. Psychologically, this is the moment of inversion. Drake's strength has always been his openness, his willingness to expose emotion, to narrate vulnerability as authenticity. Pusha T weaponizes this openness by reframing it as lack of control. The same transparency that once generated connection now becomes an opening. The persona that thrived on visibility finds itself overexposed. The strike lands not because it reveals something entirely unknown, but because it reorganizes existing information into a coherent accusation. Pusha T does not invent a new narrative. He consolidates fragments already circulating at the edges of public awareness and presents them as a unified image. In doing so, he shifts perception. What was once rumor becomes symbol. What was once noise becomes signal. The impact is immediate. The arena reacts not with debate, but with shock. Drake's dominance has relied on his ability to manage narrative flow. This moment disrupts that flow. The spotlight that once amplified his voice now fixes him in place. Silence becomes conspicuous. Response becomes risky. Every possible move carries cost. Drake's psychological position changes visibly. The confidence of scale no longer functions as insulation. The center feels exposed. Any response risks further amplification of the accusation. Any denial risks appearing evasive. The logic that sustained his dominance begins to work against him. Visibility becomes vulnerability. Pusha T, meanwhile, does not press forward indiscriminately. He understands that escalation has a ceiling. His goal is not destruction, but redefinition. By forcing Drake into a defensive posture, he accomplishes something more durable than a lyrical victory. He alters the symbolic hierarchy. The center no longer appears invulnerable. The periphery no longer appears irrelevant. Media response crystallizes this shift. Coverage moves from analysis of bars to discussion of boundaries. Questions arise about limits, about ethics, about how far conflict should go. These questions themselves signal the magnitude of the rupture. When a rivalry provokes moral debate, it has already exceeded the usual rules of engagement. Drake chooses restraint. Whether by strategy or necessity, he does not escalate further. This decision stabilizes the immediate fallout, but cedes symbolic ground. In conflicts of this nature, withdrawal is not neutral. It becomes interpretive. The absence of response is read as acknowledgement of damage, even if no such acknowledgement is made. The rivalry reaches its peak not in a final exchange, but in a recalibration of power. Drake remains dominant in scale, but altered in perception. Pusha T remains limited in reach, but expanded in authority. The terms of legitimacy have shifted. The genre has been reminded that centrality does not guarantee control, and that pressure applied at the right point can outweigh mass. This final movement completes the escalation. The conflict has traveled from inherited tension to structural incompatibility to personal exposure. It has tested not only two artists, but the system that elevated them. The question it leaves behind is not who won, but what was revealed about how power operates in hip-hop when visibility meets resistance. The rivalry now moves beyond the artists themselves. Its consequences will unfold at the level of culture. Once the rivalry passed its point of escalation, it ceased to belong exclusively to the two artists involved. It entered the wider cultural bloodstream, where its meaning could no longer be controlled by intent or clarified by response. What mattered now was not what had been said, but what the conflict made visible about the structure of hip-hop itself. The rivalry became a lens. Through it, long-standing tensions within the genre were suddenly legible. At the center of this shift was a recalibration of how power was perceived. For years, dominance in hip-hop had increasingly aligned with ubiquity. Streams, placements, brand alliances, and algorithmic presence functioned as proof of legitimacy. Drake embodied this model perfectly. He was not merely successful. He was structurally embedded in the mechanisms that determined what success looked like. The rivalry disrupted the assumption that such embeddedness was unassailable. Pusha T's intervention demonstrated that symbolic authority could still operate independently of scale. His impact did not come from outnumbering Drake's audience. It came from reframing the terms under which that audience understood dominance. He did not compete within Drake's arena. He changed the lighting. By shifting attention from output to construction, from visibility to authorship, he exposed a fault line that many listeners already sensed but had not articulated. This reframing activated deep psychological dynamics within the audience. Listeners were no longer reacting solely as fans. They reacted as participants in a collective negotiation about authenticity. The rivalry polarized identification, not simply Drake versus Pusha T, but expansion versus restraint, mediation versus origin, flexibility versus fidelity. These oppositions had always existed within hip-hop. The rivalry crystallized them into a narrative conflict. Tribalism intensified. Social platforms became extensions of the arena. Arguments unfolded not just about lyrics, but about values. What kind of artist deserved authority? What kind of success counted? The conflict functioned as a symbolic referendum. People did not merely choose sides. They chose models of belonging. For some, Drake represented possibility, mobility, and emotional access. For others, he represented dilution, overexposure, and compromised authorship. Pusha T, in turn, became a symbol of resistance for those wary of hip-hop's assimilation into mass culture. Media amplification deepened these divisions. Coverage often framed the rivalry in moral terms rather than artistic ones. Questions of fairness, limits, and responsibility entered the discourse. This shift mattered. It indicated that the conflict had exceeded entertainment. When a rivalry provokes ethical debate, it reveals anxiety about the system that produced it. The genre was not just watching two artists clash. It was watching itself being interrogated. The rivalry also exposed how modern media environments reshape conflict. Information no longer needed to be new to be powerful. It needed to be organized. The impact came from synthesis, not revelation. This altered how audiences understood influence. Authority was no longer tied solely to access or reach, but to the ability to impose narrative coherence on dispersed facts. Pusha T's role in the conflict exemplified this shift. He functioned less as an aggressor and more as an editor of public perception. This dynamic challenged the genre's evolving relationship with exposure. Hip-hop had long valued disclosure, but the scale of modern visibility changed its stakes. What once signaled authenticity now risked exploitation. The rivalry highlighted this paradox. Drake's openness had been integral to his appeal. In this context, it became a vulnerability. The culture was forced to reconsider where the line between transparency and overexposure should be drawn. At a collective level, the conflict reaffirmed the enduring appeal of rivalry as a meaning-making mechanism. Rivalries provide structure. They simplify complex dynamics into legible oppositions. They allow audiences to process abstract tensions through personalized narratives. The Pusha T and Drake rivalry served this function precisely because it mirrored broader anxieties about hip-hop's direction. It allowed those anxieties to be dramatized, debated, and symbolically resolved without requiring systemic change. Importantly, the rivalry did not reverse hip-hop's trajectory towards scale and integration. Drake's continued dominance made that clear, but it complicated the narrative of inevitability. It reminded the culture that centrality could still be challenged, not through imitation but through refusal, not through expansion but through pressure applied at the right point. In this sense, the rivalry operated as a cultural checkpoint. It marked a moment when the genre briefly looked inward and asked what it was trading for growth. It did not answer the question definitively, but it made the question unavoidable. That alone ensured its lasting symbolic weight. By the time the immediate reactions settled, the conflict had already done its work. It had altered perception. It had reshaped discourse. It had reminded both artists and audiences that hip-hop's internal tensions remain active, even as the genre continues to globalize. What remained was not resolution, but residue. And that residue would shape how the rivalry was remembered, interpreted, and integrated into the genre's evolving mythology. In the aftermath, the rivalry does not conclude so much as settle into the architecture of the culture. It stops generating new exchanges, but it continues to generate meaning. Its power lies precisely in this persistence. It becomes a reference point, a case study, a myth that can be reactivated whenever similar tensions surface. The absence of further escalation does not signal closure. It signals absorption. Drake's position after the conflict remains structurally dominant. His reach is undiminished. His presence continues to define mainstream tempo. Yet something subtle has shifted. The aura of invulnerability that once surrounded his centrality is altered, not shattered, but marked. The rivalry introduces a visible seam in the narrative of effortless dominance. From this point forward, Drake's openness is read with greater ambivalence. Transparency no longer functions as pure strength. It carries memory. Pusha T's position changes differently. His scale remains limited by design, but his symbolic authority expands. He becomes less a participant in the constant churn of releases and more a fixed reference. His role crystallizes as that of an enforcer of boundaries, not a ruler, but a reminder. He occupies a space similar to a monument on the edge of the city, not central but unavoidable. His presence signals that there are still lines that cannot be crossed without consequence. The genre internalizes this outcome. Artists and audiences alike absorb the lesson without necessarily articulating it. Visibility is power, but it is also exposure. Expansion creates opportunity, but it also creates surface area. The rivalry becomes shorthand for this paradox. When questions of authenticity, authorship, or overreach arise, its shadow appears, not as a warning, but as context. Importantly, the rivalry resists clean moral framing. It does not resolve into hero and villain. Drake is neither dethroned nor redeemed. Pusha T is neither crowned nor dismissed. This ambiguity is part of its durability. Myths that endure are rarely tidy. They remain open to reinterpretation. Each generation projects its own anxieties onto them. The media continues to revisit the conflict, not because of new developments, but because of its structural clarity. It offers a narrative through which broader shifts can be understood. The transition from scarcity to saturation, from locality to global reach, from authorship to mediation. The rivalry condenses these transformations into a human scale. two figures standing on opposite sides of a fault line that predates them and will outlast them. Psychologically, the conflict also leaves behind a template for how power can be challenged without displacement. Pusha T does not replace Drake. He does not seize the center. He proves that the center can be pressured without being occupied. This is a crucial distinction. It suggests a model of resistance that does not seek domination, but recognition of limits. In a culture increasingly oriented toward total visibility, that model carries quiet significance. For Drake, the rivalry becomes part of his narrative accumulation. Another chapter in a career defined by confrontation and survival. It does not define him, but it reframes certain aspects of his persona. His later moves carry an awareness of that exposure. Control becomes more guarded, disclosure more measured. The experience lingers as calibration. For Pusha T, the rivalry reinforces his chosen posture. It validates restraint. It confirms that concentration can still generate impact in a system optimized for diffusion. His subsequent work does not need to reference the conflict directly. Its existence already speaks. The myth has done its work. Ultimately, the legacy of the rivalry lies in what it refuses to offer. No reconciliation, no definitive winner, no closing statement. Instead, it leaves behind a clarified landscape. Power is not singular. Legitimacy is contested. Visibility is not synonymous with control. These truths were always present in hip-hop. The rivalry made them visible again. That is why it remains relevant. Not as spectacle, but as structure. A moment when the genre briefly saw itself reflected with unusual sharpness. And once seen, that reflection cannot be unseen.